A couple months ago, I made a video on unicorn ranching, and at one point in that video, I traded a caged unicorn to some merchants. That idea of trading caged creatures for goods has lingered with me in the months since, and I wanted to do it again, just with something a little less friendly than tame unicorns this time. And so I started a new fortress with a plan to spend 5 years collecting as many monsters as I could get my hands on, and a hope that capturing monsters and selling them to merchants could be profitable. Upon arrival, I put my dwarves to work getting the fortress up and running. They dug out the basic outline of the base, constructed the necessary workshops in the workshop nooks, and started making furniture so they wouldn't have to sleep on the floor. I was also in a bit of a rush to find the caverns that we would be building our traps in, and my dwarves would need food at some point, so I also got them to dig down and build themselves a farm in the first cavern they found. Once the farm was finished and the fortress was suitably furnished, I was ready to go lay some monster traps. But the fortress had only 16 dwarves in it, and I wanted to have 3 fully filled out and trained squads ready to go before we messed around in the caverns, to keep any cage haulers or trap reloaders safe from the monsters on any of the 3 cavern layers. That did leave me with very little to do though. To whittle away at the time between migrant waves, I did order my miners to dig down and look around for more caverns, but after uncovering them, there wasn't really much I could do with them, other than build empty cage stockpiles near where I would be placing traps. With that last bit of actual preparatory work out of the way, I was forced to move on to just watching my dwarves live their mundane little lives and waiting for more migrants to arrive. Eventually, a year and a half into my 5-year window, we had enough dwarves in the fortress that I could recruit the 6 most useless to be soldiers in the first squad, and then it still took another year after that for the 30 most useless dwarves to have been recruited, and for all 3 squads to be full. While that was good news, the autumn that brought the final migrants we needed also marked the slightly more than halfway point in the time I had given myself, which made me nervous. I felt like we needed to get a move on, because time was running out and we had yet to catch a single monster. And so even though some of the soldiers I had drafted had only a couple days of training under their belts, I gave the order to begin building cage traps on cavern layers 2 and 3. Once those had been completed easily and without issue, we moved on to cavern layer 1, which I was the most nervous about. You see, over the preceding 2.5 years, I had seen some concerning things from cavern 1. Things like a giant alligator made of salt, a giant nematode with web shooting capabilities, and invisible enemies that killed them both. A dwarf had eventually discovered that those invisible enemies were in fact just serpent people, but I still wasn't sure just how many serpents there might be. With no way to find out, and potential monster trading profits on the line, I decided to just send my dwarves out into the darkness and hope for the best. It turned out that the darkness was scary, and my hope was misplaced though, as numerous serpents sprang up to attack my soldiers. At first, I still thought that my soldiers had things handled, but seemingly endless hordes of serpents kept springing up out of the woodwork. With only a couple of well-trained soldiers left facing the horde, I made the genius decision to sacrifice 2 squads full of untrained soldiers to the snakes as well, which I'm sure they appreciated. With the combined military might of my fortress crushed, I locked off the doors to the blood-soaked first cavern layer and decided to pivot and refocus my monster-catching efforts on the more peaceful and tranquil cavern layers below. And I even had a handful of lazy and traitorous soldiers who hadn't bothered to show up to the last stand by my side to help me do it. With my new business plan in mind, I checked out caverns 2 and 3 to scout out new cage trap locations. To my surprise, our existing cage traps had already seen some action, while all of the soldiers were dying up in cavern 1. We had a giant rat caught in cavern 2, and a reacher caught in cavern 3. Their cages were retrieved, and their traps were reloaded without an issue, and after installing the extra cage traps I had come down there for, it was time to focus on monster catching. The next 2 years flew by as I oversaw the caverns and watched a wide variety of creatures come in and get caught in our cages. Angry olm men, oblivious plump helmet men, and bulky jabberers all found themselves on the wrong side of a cage at various points. This amounted to a handful of captures over the years, 10 at most, which would be a fairly unimpressive haul if it made up the totality of what I had for the merchants. Fortunately though, my animal stockpiles were looking pretty good, and I had the humble crundle to thank for that. They were dumb, they were plentiful, and they weren't that dangerous, and so I had built up a little crundle army for myself. When the caravan arrived in the autumn of the 4th year, the monster collection phase of my plan was over, and it was time to bring all the cages to the depot to see if I had caught anything of value. I thought that my army of crundle cages would be the most annoying things to move, but it turns out that you can't actually sell sentient creatures, and attempting to do so resulted in the Reacher, some old men, and some plump helmet people being released into the fortress without warning. Things quickly turned violent down in the animal stockpile, but fortunately the creatures seemed just as confused about their release as I was, and they didn't really manage to hurt anyone too badly. Once they were wiped out, my dwarves could go back to hauling cages undisturbed, and eventually even the child carrying the 5,500 kilogram jabberer made it to the trade depot. As I tallied up the total value of my monsters, I saw that the weight of what we had to sell might be a problem. Because while they were worth a little over 10,000 dwarf bucks, minus the value of all those beautiful cages, the merchants were saying that our monsters would put them nearly 15,000 kilograms over what they could carry. I cut down my offerings to just a handful of my most valuable crundles, and ended up walking away from the trading table with a good amount of booze to show for it, but I was a little disappointed that selling monsters was so unprofitable. In a last-ditch effort to get all the value out of my monsters that I could, I set up a training area and some nest boxes, and tried to trade some crundle eggs for a wheel of cheese, but apparently the merchants weren't that interested in my weird eggs. Some merchants wouldn't know the deal of a lifetime if it hatched into a fully grown crundle right in front of their face. Thanks for watching, an extra thank you to those of you who support me on Patreon, and I'll see you next time.